When Anne Frank arrived in Holland in 1933, she was enrolled, I think, in a Montessori school. And am I right, your first husband taught her?
Well, he taught her when she had to go to the Jewish school, because he taught Latin and Greek in the Jewish secondary school, and she was there, and she actually came to our place once with some work she had done and wanted to give to my husband and have a talk about.
What impression did she make on you?
Of a very happy young girl at that time. Very good looking, intelligent, more grown up.
I was born in a little town in Germany called Eschwege, where my dad was a secondary school teacher, probably something similar to Marlborough College. He was teaching maths and sciences to students who were both Jewish and not Jewish. But in 1936, the year after I was born, it became impossible for a Jewish person to teach non-Jewish children. They thought that a Jewish teacher might contaminate the pupils, so my dad lost his job.
Can you describe how things changed once the Germans occupied the Netherlands in 1940?
Things changed in several ways, different ways. Naturally, the Jews weren't allowed to be teachers or doctors or whatever. For non-Jews, you weren't allowed to go to non-Jewish places. You weren't allowed in cafes, in theaters, in trams. It was difficult, especially, but it all came gradually.
At the first month and the first year, the Germans slowly brought in new rules, very slowly, you know.
The Germans occupied Hungary on the 19th of March, which was a Sunday. We came home and my parents were panicking. We didn't know because there was no war, there were no visible signs of German occupation, but they knew that. And within a week, it became too dangerous to go out in the evening.
Did they close the schools?
I went to an ordinary school. No, the school didn't close. Just Jewish children didn't go to school anymore.
At first you thought, oh, life is just going on. But then there came, you are not allowed to do this and you are not allowed to do that. And then the star, the David star, came for the Jews to wear.
That's what it looked like. It's the Star of David with the German word for Jew on here, so that anybody who might come across us in the street might laugh at us, might throw stones at us, might require us to get off the footpath so that they could go past.
When that happened in Amsterdam, they had a strike. The trams didn't ride and everything was... but then they shoot people on the street. And then you had to... you had to obey, of course. So that was the first, that the Jews had to wear a star.
Were you aware of what the consequences might be? For example, if you were caught not wearing the yellow star?
Yes.
What would have happened?
You would have been shot on the spot, taken away, whatever. We didn't need to spell it out. Terrible things would happen.
My father was serving on the town council. My mother was a teacher. And in 1941, our world turned upside down. 15 men of the community were murdered. My father was among them, and they were buried in a mass grave.
We had Jewish friends in Amsterdam especially, but we were non-Jews. But in 41 we got married and we moved to the country, to a little village. And then people started to hide people from the Germans.
My mother could see that things were very risky for me as a little child. So my mother arranged for a Catholic woman whom she knew to take me in. And one evening I was taken to a farm and left. But I do remember that Mrs. Kalavichova and her son looked after me really well, and they were raising me as a Catholic. They told me I was Jewish, and that if anybody found out that I was Jewish, we would all be killed.
We were asked if we could have people, and we had a rather big house, a man's, and so we had room for them. Under the roof they had a small place. We had the carpenter doing the builder, making there something that we could push in. Well, they could have found it. Everybody who hired people, they were in danger, of course. And certain times there were rumors that they were coming to pick up my husband or whatever. You always had to be aware of the danger, and it's very often that he slept in other places, because most of the time the Germans came to pick you up during the night. It was good at our place, but they were very limited. They couldn't go out, couldn't go in the backyard or in the garden. So they had to be inside all the time.
My parents went in hiding, but we all looked not Jewish. My father did. And I was blonde.
And blue-eyed.
Yes. So we had a chance of doing something. And I, for a while, had this Jewish school, and then was put in a camp because the Germans offered teachers, lawyers, art people to go in a camp to be saved. And although I didn't want to go because I didn't trust them, my husband was very scared and he wanted to go, so we went into there until they brought the whole camp to Germany when we escaped.
So the camp was not sealed off?
Well, the camp was sealed off in a way by a metal fence, but on one side we had a farm, and the farmer had cut a part of the fence, and so we escaped through that hole. And from there, my husband went in hiding with a friend of mine, and I had an old aunt, and she and her children had gone to live with a farmer because they hadn't anything enough to eat, and her flat was empty. And so I was offered to stay in that flat. I had two people in hiding there, which was quite nice.
So your parents went into hiding?
Yes.
But you didn't?
I lived under a false name. I had 3 different false names.
The British and the American Air Force started bombing Budapest. And using that as a pretext, they confiscated apartments from Jewish residents. So Jews had to move into apartments specially designated for Jews. And we had this family we lived on the 2nd floor of this building. They lived directly above us on the 5th floor, and they moved in with us. you know, we didn't get on. They moved in because ours was the Jewish apartment in the building. And there was a curfew, so people couldn't leave the flat except for 2 hours a day. There was total anarchy and terror. Jewish buildings were closed down for 4 days. Arrow Cross gangs went door to door and arrested Jewish men. And one of my very vivid memories was these young Arrow Cross teenagers in uniforms, armbands, guns, coming and ordering all the men to line up in the courtyard. And my mother hid my brother and me down in the basement where the firewood was kept, covered us up with a rug so that we were quite invisible. My grandfather was the only man in our family around, and I believe that the men were saved because the caretaker of the building, an old socialist and the printer, rang up the district commander of these Arrow Cross hoodlums and got him to call them off. There is a sad angle to this because the poor man was murdered, shot before the end of the war. But my great regret is that I can see the man vividly in my mind, but I can't remember his name.
So you're living in a form of confinement, in very cramped conditions?
Yes.
How did you occupy yourself?
Play chess and fought with my brother. And and that kept adding on my grandfather's nerve. I think he said, one of the family saying, stop fighting, go and play chess. So we must have played chess. But no, it's unending boredom. There was nothing you could do.
And wasn't there a morgue across the road?
Yes, people gradually died, and I don't think that people were actually killed in the ghetto, not normally. There might have been the odd person trying to escape or get out who might have been shot, but people just died of malnutrition, starvation. My grandfather's sister-in-law just faded away, died. I always associate this morgue with her because I would see from our window people pushing bodies in push carts down to the shop exactly opposite where we lived, and the bodies were stacked up like firewood in this shop.
You joined the Dutch underground?
Naturally. You had to do something.
So you effectively became a member of the resistance?
Yes.
What did that involve?
Well, it involved different things for different people. Because I was a chemist, I had to clean identity cards. So that was one thing I did, get identity cards to people. And the other thing was helping to put people in hiding somewhere, especially children.
How did you go about making false identity papers?
Well, the first lot was papers that were stolen or lost, so-called lost, or papers that were of people that had died, or people that had just not got their cards yet. And naturally, we kept the names, but the rest, the photo had to be cleaned, taken off, and the photo was done with a stamp on it. And then you had to have a new signature, and you had to have a thumbprint. And naturally, you had to get a card of somebody that was roughly the same age. Yeah. And that was usually possible, but it was very difficult, and there were very few cards.
If your work wasn't absolutely first rate, the people that you were providing these cards to would have been in mortal danger.
Yes, yes. But there was only one possibility, because if you didn't have a card, you couldn't get food coupons. And the people that you stayed with didn't have much food anyway.
What would have happened to you if you'd been caught?
I would probably have been sent to Germany or shot immediately.
All women between the ages of 18 and 40 had to report to the brickworks. And I remember my mother carrying this backpack which she sewed herself. The backpack was almost as big as she was, and off they went to the brickworks. I think we understood that once you went off to the brickworks, you didn't come back, not immediately.
And maybe never.
And maybe never.
The Jews had to work, so they employed them where they wanted them, and if they didn't need them anymore, they went to the gas chambers.
In August 1942, we got the word from the Nazis that we had to report to the big railway station in Frankfurt because we were going to be deported. We had no idea where we were going to. I certainly didn't as a 6-year-old boy. The members of my family, the immediate members who were involved, were my father, my mother and I, and 2 grandmothers, one of whom was 68 years old at the time, and the other one, my father's mother, was 90 years old. And you can imagine how particularly the old people, how much stress they were under when they were required to just come to a railway station with virtually nothing other than their immediate belongings and not knowing what was going to happen next. Of course, rumor had got around as to what was happening in these concentration camps. The one memory I have of the time that we reported at the railway station was when one of the Nazi officers asked my dad whether he had any money on him, because we were not allowed to take any valuables, no jewelry, no cash. And my dad, who really thought that he had nothing on him, said, "No, I haven't." They searched him and they found the equivalent of a 50-cent piece in one of his pockets. And this Nazi officer hit him across the face several times till his nose bled. And that's the one lasting memory that I have of that particular time. We were required to get on a train, and we were taken after 2 days to a town in Czechoslovakia, which is the country adjoining Germany.
This happened out in the countryside. It started within a couple of weeks of the German occupation. In 56 days, they shipped 437,000 Jews to Auschwitz, and about 400,000 of them were gassed immediately on arrival.
I was fortunate, if one can be fortunate in a concentration camp, that it was basically a transit camp. It wasn't one of those places where they had the gas chambers. It was one where people were gathered together to be transported further on into Poland, where most of them were then killed in gas chambers or shot, or whatever the Nazis decided to do. The trip that took us from Germany to the concentration camp had 1,000 people on that train. 17 of those 1,000 survived, so I was one of 17. There were 10,000 children in the camp from time to time, and only 100 of them survived. So I'm 1% of the lucky ones who did survive.
You had to be lucky. In the camp that my mother was in, out of the 2,500 women, 400 survived. In the camp that my father was in, Gunskirchen, which was one of the sub-camps of Mauthausen, out of 17,000 who were taken there in April 1945, only about 5,000 were still alive early in May, so 3 or 4 weeks later.
You ended up in the Budapest ghetto?
By a roundabout way, yes, yes.
Well, tell me about that.
All right. We had to report thousands and thousands of people all waiting, all lined up. My aunt was handicapped, and my grandfather said to the policeman who was guarding this column, he said, how is she going to manage? How is she going to, can we make sure that she doesn't fall behind? And the policeman said to my grandfather, don't worry, I'll look after her. And put her at the very head of the column so that she couldn't be left behind because we couldn't go any faster than my aunt. And I talk about this as an illustration of how someone was doing his job. His job was to be a policeman and guard this unit, but doing his job with a measure of compassion.
Communique number 1. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
My father was picked up by an American jeep and taken to what was previously a German Air Force hospital. And there he had typhus, he was grossly undernourished, about 30 kilos for a man whose normal weight would have been over 70 kilos. But somehow he survived. Had the Americans liberated the camp a day later, he wouldn't have survived. My mother and father came back. It was so amazing, so remarkable.
Eventually, a young woman came, and Mrs. Karlovichova said that she was my sister and she'd come to claim me. And of course, Mrs. Karlovichova didn't want to let me go with the slip of a girl of 18 after she'd taken such a risk looking after me. But in the end, she did. And so my sister and I found a group of other survivors, and we moved right across Poland, deeper into Poland, and into West Berlin, and into a displaced persons camp where we had food and shelter, medical attention, and a school for me.
What happened to your father once you'd been in Czechoslovakia? Did he go with you? Or?
He became ill, had to have an operation, and died during the operation because there were just no facilities to help him survive.
How much people do you reckon died?
The answer is 6 million people. Now, the Germans were very good at keeping records. They have a pretty good idea of how many Jews there were in Europe before the war and how many there were after the war. But it wasn't only Jews. It was also those who were considered by the Nazis to be of a lower quality, were not fit to be alive, like infirm persons, homosexuals, communists, and so on.
There was evidence that the Nazis tried to cover up the horror. But nevertheless, there it was for the world to see. And I think a lot of people go to Auschwitz now and to Dachau and see for themselves. One of the generals who led the army to liberate the camps was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he became president of the United States sometime later. And he asked his soldiers to have a good look at what they saw and to take photographs so that if anyone said that this didn't happen, that they would have the evidence in their minds.
Did you have any relatives that were able to escape Germany before any major events happened?
Just the people in New Zealand, and my sister and her family are the only relatives that I have in the world, apart from our 3 children and grandchildren.
And we started to study it and going into the history of why things happened and all of that was actually the point where I realised, you know, the extent of what my grandparents actually went through. I think people don't really have a general understanding of what, you know, what extent the Holocaust was and what really happened, and I think it's really important for people to know the story so that it doesn't happen again.
I lost an awful lot, and one of them was the loss of my identity. I don't even know when my birthday is. I can't remember how my parents looked, and I have no family history. And I didn't really discover the horrors of the Holocaust until I was in the displaced persons camp, where a number of families shared one huge room, and when they thought the children were asleep, they used to share their stories, and that's when I realized what horrible experiences some people had. So I decided that I was very, very lucky indeed, and my philosophy now is to look ahead, not look back.
This might sound weird, but like, it's almost that you guys are like restarting over your family tree. Say like, you know?
Absolutely.
It's starting again. How?
Absolutely, we're starting our family tree because the other one is gone on my side of the family. So it is. It's starting again, and that's the important thing. Look forward. Yes.
Stephen, it seems obscene that people who'd somehow survived the Holocaust would feel guilty afterwards for surviving. But many felt that. What were your feelings afterwards?
Anger. I could not understand how people were prepared to go along with, if you were told to report somewhere, you reported, you didn't do, there was no resistance. And this is something that and nor did the people who were part of your community, your friends, did nothing about it, nothing to resist. I really just felt very angry. And this anger stayed with me all these years. It is still something that I can understand it rationally. How could you resist? But it's still emotionally, I can't understand it.
In the 18th century, a philosopher called Edmund Burke said this, and this is what I'd like you to remember when you hear anything about the Holocaust. All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
When I was 19, I got this. Dit is de Yad Vashem. Dat is an organization, international, about people who have sheltered Jews. And you get a recognition as people, righteous people, they call it. Yeah, it was very moving that so late in life that I got this award, and I'm very grateful for it to Yad Vashem.
Dora, when you look back now, aged 95,
Yes.
on this...
You don't have to tell everybody that.
It's secret between you and me. On this extraordinary period of your life, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that I did what I could do, and I was in a way lucky. I think it's a pity that people don't know how many people went through difficulties and how bad the Germans and the whole Nazi ideas were, and that we went through a whole lot of things And I hope that we did something right.